Okay.
Clarence was a veteran, U.S. Army, where he served in the 1991 Gulf War. Upon his return, Clarence attended Ohio State University, where he earned both of his undergraduate and law degree in under 5 years. How did you do that? It's impressive. After law school, private practice, he went into helping to protect citizens most in need. Franklin County courts frequently appointed Clarence to serve as guardian, representing the interest of children in abuse and neglect in divorce cases. Also serving as legal aid to Columbus Neighborhoods Project, Clarence was one of the 3 attorneys represented the indigent county residents involving legal issues such as housing, public benefits, civil protective orders, and custody matters. Then in 2007, Chief Justice Thomas Moyer appointed Clarence as commissioner of the Ohio Court of Claims, where Clarence served as one of the 7 commissioners with statewide appellate jurisdiction in victims of crime cases where he met my father, Thomas Bainbridge. And then in 2010, Franklin County voters awarded him a full 4-year term after being appointed originally as Franklin County Auditor. Governor Kasich appointed Clarence to also serve on the Ohio Lottery Commission. In 2014, Auditor Mingo was also featured by MSNBC as one of the rising stars within the state of Ohio. And I can honestly say, though we won't be seeing him on the Franklin County Auditor's office, this is not the last time we'll see him in public service. He'll be elected again soon to something much better. Clarence?
Good afternoon to all of you. Very good. I'm Clarence Mingo, and I am unemployed. That's okay. This is a matter of public record. And I will tell you, when you are unemployed, things look different. Your life is a bit different. I have not seen many of you in some time. In scanning the audience, I see many familiar faces, friends and relatives in some cases. And it's good to be back. It's good to be home. Very good to see you, Dr. Weiler, and our county engineer there, Cornell Robertson, and my good friend George. My baby sister is here, recently appointed by Governor Kasich as the environmental judge in municipal court, Judge Stephanie Mingo. Yeah. Now, I have to be honest, it's hard when your baby sister's in the game and you're on the bench. It's okay. These things require maturity, and I'm committed to working through it. Special thanks to Brian Bainbridge, his family, the Bainbridge family. I've known these folks for the better part of a decade. And Brian's dad, he has been a mentor, a friend, a voice and light at dark moments in my life. And I really commend his family in the highest, and appreciate the fidelity that exists between us, Brian. So very good to see you. So it's an honor to stand before you. It's been some time. I think I may have last been here maybe 3 years ago. And this, as you know, is February, and it is Black History Month. And I think our conversation, for purposes of today, will prove timely because there is a lot happening by way of race relations in the United States of America. And one would think that with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965 and a bevy of other measures of legislation, along with the election of an African-American president and the coming together and ending of segregation between Black Americans and white Americans, you would think that in the year 2019 things would be dramatically better, and the understanding and the differences that exist between the two cultures would be dramatically improved. And I would be less than honest if I did not agree that things are, in some measure, considerably better. And there is cause for celebration, and there are points of improvement that we can identify that give great credibility to the idea that America, from the standpoint of race relations, is infinitely better off than it would have been maybe 45 years ago. But even still, we are greatly challenged at this hour, and evidence of this abounds by way of media. You can pick up a newspaper if you so choose to decide and read on any given day of some measure of racial disparity or difference that is occurring between Americans. And so today I want to highlight maybe 3 or 4 points for us to consider as we journey through Black History Month, and more importantly, simply as Americans, right? What should we be thinking about the state of race relations? And then more importantly, what's the cure, right? What are some of the remedies that we can employ to ensure that we as Americans, one to another, are fellowshipping in a way that is more meaningful and more reflective of who we are as a nation? I'll offer you 3 points. So in the last 48 hours, we have read of the governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam, who was elected with great promise and certainly has a record of accomplishment. As you know, recently, photographs emerged that showed him standing next to a member of the Ku Klux Klan and in blackface. And media and other organizations immediately began to research the entire history behind these photos. And this, as we now know, has really commanded national and international attention because the sitting governor of Virginia has a racial mark in his past that is, in simplest terms, ugly. And we all watched the interview in which the governor really indicated to the nation what his perspective would be on this issue. Would he resign? Would he stay in office? And how would he handle this very difficult situation? And we now know that the governor of Virginia, Governor Northam, has decided that he will stay in office, and explained how it is these photographs came to be, and he gave definition and context as to what the photos were meant to convey at a particular point in time. And for general purposes, he was in denial about the consequence and the impact of these photographs. Across the country elsewhere is Congressman Steve King. Now, Congressman King has been in the news for the last 4 or 5 weeks, and truthfully for the last 4 or 5 years, for a cadre of racial remarks. Congressman King is on record of having been in hearty agreement with the authoritarian leader of Hungary by endorsing this statement: mixing cultures will not lead to a higher quality of life, but to a lower one. And then on the Iowa Talk radio show, Congressman King commented that The Camp of the Saints, which is a 1973 racist novel about an invasion of Europe by non-white immigrants, is a must-read. And then there was one other quote. It goes as follows: we can't restore our civilization with someone else's babies. Now, what's interesting about these two men is simply this. Both men at various points in times appear to be relatively unashamed and in deep denial about the consequence of their rhetoric and past action. And this is noteworthy because the times in which we are living, people who have power or people who have wealth or people who may have simply misstepped are less inclined when caught to say or do anything other than, I was not wrong, I was likely right, and there's no other way to see it. Now, this is very challenging because the truth is, with the measure of technology that abounds today, in which our every word and our every action is recorded and has the ability to be projected almost instantly around the world, at a time when the news cycle is literally 25 hours a day nonstop, people are very reluctant and hesitant to admit any measure of misstep or wrongdoing. I think what we must do is create a path when we misstep and create an additional path for recovery on these occasions. And I want to tell you what that looks like. Let's talk about the need for a path when one missteps. The only path is simply this: an outright apology bathed in humility. Listen, the truth is, every single one of us in this room have likely said or done something that was inappropriate. I stand before you as an African American, and I can tell you at some point in the last 5 years, or perhaps even in the last year, I said or did something or otherwise had a thought that was simply inappropriate about somebody else. And some of us have the dramatic misfortune of having that misstep made public. These things will happen, and it's due and owing sometimes to our ignorance, sometimes to our lack of understanding, sometimes simply to our human nature. But the only response on such occasions is simply this: an apology that owns up to the misstep, that embraces the wrong, that takes ownership of what happened, and simply reaches out and asks for a measure of understanding, perhaps of mercy, grace, and moreover, simple forgiveness. The art of the apology is a lost skill in the American experience. We no longer do it because we believe if we can stand up and say, I did not, I did not, I did not, if we can say it loud enough and long enough, somebody will believe us. And these days, maybe that's all you need to carry on. The art of the apology is literally the path to recovery under those circumstances where we misstep by way of race relations and racial offenses. That's half the story. The other half of the story is this: when that apology is issued, we the watching public have a responsibility to survey and to listen very carefully to that apology. And more often than not, we have to welcome that individual back into the fold. We're living in a time, in a day and age right now where if you do something wrong, and if it is in a racial context, your entire life, your entire career is suddenly ripped apart because the culture does not quickly allow you to recover, will not often welcome and receive your apology back, and often will brand you with that scarlet letter wherein you are always reminded that you are the person who used the N-word, or you are the person that said something despicable or disgraceful about someone's race or someone's gender or someone's culture. We as a society, if not for our own sake, have to become masters at receiving that apology and welcoming an individual back into our culture, because our goal is this: not to punish the offender eternally and not to celebrate what was done wrong, but to celebrate the redeemed, the individual who had the courage to say, I was wrong, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have said it, and it shouldn't have happened. Our hand must be extended when sincerity abounds in that apology, and when an individual is committed to living his life better. That person now becomes an example of an American. The individual who thought this way, but now thinks this way. And that person is a reflection of what our society and our culture can be and must become. Friends, we have a responsibility to create a path to recovery. And we also have to create a path that is individual and encourages the person who has misstepped to take ownership of the wrong, issue that apology, and come back into the fold. We need paths for understanding for this very complex problem. My second point is this: there's two things that are interesting about the governor, Ralph Northam, and Congressman Steve King. You should note that one is a Republican and one is a Democrat. And this too is important to note because we are living in a time where the art of the apology is lost and our hearts are set against bringing people back who have apologized. But we are equally and seemingly committed to relegating a certain class of person more likely to be racially offensive than not. And this is a simple truth. Tall white men with great power, influence, and wealth who just so happen to be conservative Republicans, they are not automatically racist. They are not. Let me say this too. White men in modern day America, they are not at the core, they are not chiefly responsible for all that is wrong by way of race relations in the United States of America. This is a very broad problem. It's one that involves Democrats. It's one that involves Republicans. It involves men. It involves women. It involves people who are tall and people who are short. It involves people who are rich and people who are poor. Why? Because this is a fundamental condition of our humanity. There is something in us there is something in us that lends itself to disparaging, to failing to understand, and to often failing to appreciate the differences that exist in the fabric that we call humanity. And none of us are excluded from that potential. And so I think as we look at Congressman Steve King and Governor Ralph Northam, we all ought to be reminded that the political party that you choose to affiliate with, the zip code that you live in, or the state in which you grew up is not indicative of whether or not you are an individual who is prone to racist tendencies. This would not be true. Let me prove my point. Listen very carefully to these quotes. I discovered this some time ago, and I thought that this was compelling. Listen, the Jews caused the war. The Jews caused the outbreak of thieving and robbery all over the country. All of this was caused by the Jews. These words were spoken by none other than an American icon, Henry Ford. How about this one? I think one man is just as good as another, so long as he's honest and decent and not a or a Chinaman. Uncle Will says that the Lord made white men from dust, from mud, and then threw what was left down to the Chinaman. These words were spoken by an individual who I think was one of America's most influential presidents, Mr. Harry Truman, the man who desegregated the United States Armed Forces. How about this one? I have the greatest affection for blacks, but I know they're not going to make it another 500 years, you know. The Mexicans are a different cup of tea. They have a heritage. At the present time, they don't steal. They're relatively honest. I think they are good people. But they don't live like a bunch of dogs like the Negroes live like. And the Jews, well, they're very aggressive and abrasive, and they have obnoxious personalities. These words spoken by an American president, Richard Milhous Nixon. How about this one? They make it their own choice for staying out there. These homeless shelters are virtually in every city, and there's a shelter everywhere, and those people still prefer to go out on grates or on the lawn, going out into one of those shelters. They're responsible for the choice they're making. These words spoken by one of my favorite presidents, Mr. Ronald Reagan. Let me close out with this one. Listen carefully. I can only thank the Lord for blessing us in a wonderful way. Let me say that again. I like the way that sounds. I can only thank the Lord for blessing us in a wonderful way. In this, our first difficult struggle for our rights, I thank the Lord. I pray to him that he would let us find the right path, and again we shall find it. Precious words, spiritual words, spoken by Adolf Hitler, 1939, just 4 weeks after the conquest of Poland and the beginning of the Holocaust. My point is simply this. People are complicated. We all have the tendency to be illiterate in our thoughts, uneducated in our perspective, and harsh in our words, and none of us is above it. Many of you sitting here right now, you have parents or grandparents or had parents or grandparents or someone else influential in your life who grew up in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and those people in your childhood, you undoubtedly heard them say words that today would never pass muster. It's an aunt, it's an uncle, or perhaps it's one of your parents who didn't want someone in your life because they were a person of color. All of us have seen and been around people who we love and care about, but who have that thing in their heart that gravitates towards that which is ill and of no respect or value. That thing called racism or dislike or a refusal to embrace the experiences, the culture, and sometimes the color or gender of others. And still some of us are sitting in this room thinking right now, well, not me, I'm liberated. I've matured and grew up out of all those things. I left that type of behavior when I was in college. The truth is, if your son or daughter came home today and said, Dad, I'd like for you to meet Dante, a man whose skin color is just like mine, in the deep recesses of your heart, you might find it hard to let your neighbors know that your daughter is dating someone of color. If you are African American and you are here today, you too might find it very difficult If your son or daughter brought home a woman who had blue eyes and blonde hair, you'd think about that family photo and how you're going to explain to the relatives at the family reunion that there's a little difference occurring in your family. These things are hard and they're difficult, and we ought to search the deep recesses of our heart and destroy and root out those things that don't belong. We have to ask ourselves, why is it that we are so sensitive to the color of a person's skin? Why is it that we are so sensitive to the particular brand of a religion that someone might have? Why is it that we often look with suspicion if someone is wearing a wardrobe and head garb that is perhaps a little different than Western culture? We are all capable of these things. I count myself in that number, and I understand that the best place to start is a survey of my own heart and mind to make sure that I am looking at my fellow Americans, that I am looking at the life that is called humanity, and trying to appreciate all of you for who you are, and not fitting you squarely within a racial construct that I have about who I think you should be and what I think you should look like and how I think you should conduct yourself. We have to do better, and we have to survey our own hearts and our own minds, because none of us, be it a president or a pauper, is above the angst and the terror that are difficult racial thoughts and poor race relations. Now, there is one exception, I believe, where discrimination is permissible and where I believe it is lawful. And I believe this is found, it's in the Ohio Constitution. I know factually it's in the United States Constitution, and we ought to embrace it. And the only exception towards racism and discrimination is concerning the Michigan Wolverines. Now, I'm just saying, this is in the Bible somewhere. You can be... It's in Deuteronomy. I mean, check it out. Point number 3 would be as follows. Listen to this carefully. We must watch our words. We must watch our words and be careful not to vilify groups or people. We must watch our words, and we must be careful, very vigilant not to vilify categories of people. Let me tell you why this is important. Auschwitz, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen, Majdanek, Treblinka. These are the names of Nazi concentration camps, and they dotted the skyline of Europe from 1939 to 1945. 6 million Jews died, and an additional number of gypsies and Eastern Europeans, and 47 million other individuals as a result of one man's ability to categorize a particular group of people as less than. And the road to those categorizations that lead to death and hostility and ultimately to Holocaust is always nearby. Let me tell you what that road looks like. It's a verbal road, and this is what it does. When speaking to people about complex issues, be it politically or other things, words roll off your tongues. Words like those people at the border, or the people on that side of the wall, or those people. It's those people on welfare, or it's those poor people, right? Those poor black people. How about the people in West Virginia? The people making that choice to do that particular thing. We almost lose the ability to humanize because we no longer focus on the human condition, but we focus on the wrong or the perceived wrong. And now we're pointing the finger to a broad audience about a very narrow group of people. And friends, I have to tell you that this is dangerous. We do it socially, but we always do it politically. I'm standing before you as a conservative Republican. I'm not ashamed of that. I believe in a very strong foreign policy. I have certain thoughts about tax policy, certain thoughts about the influence of the United States, both domestically and abroad. And these thoughts really form the basis or foundation of my conservative beliefs and values. But I'm also very careful not to speak about and not to speak of individuals who think opposite of me, be they referred to as liberal or Democrats, in a way that suggests they are less than I am because of what they believe. And I've been a delegate at the Republican convention 2 times over. 2012, I was a delegate for the state of Ohio. I was also on the platform committee. One of 100 people chosen from the ranks of the Republicans who are responsible for writing what the party would stand for the next 4 years. And this was a high honor. And I had to guard my heart and mind because in such meetings, in undertaking such work, you start to think of the people who are opposite you as something less than human. Those Democrats, those liberals, you know how those liberals are. I've been in church. I've been in church on more than one occasion after the pastor has preached a marvelous message about grace, love, and mercy, right? Only to hear someone out in the foyer talking about, got to get rid of those DAMN Democrats. They have to go. I've been in other places and people have talked about the racist Republicans. You know, they're all big white men and they have all the power and they've got their thumb on our backs. Those Republicans. This is dangerous. This rhetoric is dangerous because when we use words in a casual way like that, we are distancing the individual and what they believe in from the humanity that we all embrace. And this is very dangerous. We have seen a dozen times over in modern times where words alone have become the catalyst to hate, to bigotry, to harm, and ultimately towards death. And so we have to be very careful, very guarded, and very mindful of our words and our rhetoric and how our beliefs and passions are conveyed. Now, let me take this a step further. If you are a person of individual, if you are a person of stature or of rank, or you have profound influence, your responsibility is heightened. Your responsibility is heightened. If you are the President of the United States, you have to be very careful about how you speak and how you consider not only your fellow Americans, but the entire human condition has to be given and accorded the highest measure of respect, even when it is in the midst of something wrong. The fundamentals of humanity have to be respected and honored, even by the President. If you sit on a bench and you decide life or death for an individual, and you decide freedom or incarceration for the population, how you speak of those individuals who stand before you, privately or publicly, you have a responsibility to give thought to the human condition and speak of them in a way, even though they might have been wrong, even though they may have run afoul of the law, your responsibility is to accord dignity and respect, at least to the proposition that we all share a common thread, and that is called humanity. Now, I'm a father of 2. Ava and Annalise, they're 13 and 14. One's a Republican, one's a Democrat. There's a lot of therapy going on right now. We've got social workers, people really trying to help the family. That's true. And my daughter, Annalise, this is just as she turned 14. I said, now listen, Annalise, you're 14 now, and the guys are going to start noticing you, and you may very well start noticing them. But I said the Ohio Constitution, she knows I'm a lawyer, unemployed albeit, but still have my law license. The Ohio Constitution says you are not eligible to marry until you are 40, right? Now, I have her believing this. And I said, when you turn 40, if God permits you to find a creature called a man that you have an interest in becoming your husband, there are 2 requirements that he must meet. First requirement is simply this. He has to be a patriot. Listen, this fella has to be a veteran. He has to show some foundational love for our country, and he has to have demonstrated the will and the commitment to serve it sacrificially as a soldier in the United States Army or even the United States Marine Corps, Air Force, Navy, or the like. This guy has to be a veteran. Second thing he has to do, Annalise, is he has to have a fade. Now, a fade is a haircut like mine. Guy's got to have a fade. Can't have hair down his neck unless he's got to have it. It's got to be no hair. He has to have a fade. Now, Annalisa's wise, and she's like, Dad, okay, that's not right. I said, why? Oh, because only black men have fades. So now you're telling me I can only marry a black man. I had to think about this, and I quickly said, well, that's not true. Justin Timberlake has a fade. He's almost black. Then I reminded her last night watching the Super Bowl. I found a picture, Googled it. Tom Brady. Tom Brady had a fade. And my point is simply this. Our words, narrowly spoken without definition in the minds of a young person, can easily be misconstrued or taken as law, and they will run with it. And so the things I tell my daughters about how they are to interact with people, how they are to respect people, and the level of appreciation they are to have for individuals who are likely opposite of them must be high. Every white person you meet, I don't care what their past has been relative to a Jew or me, you have a responsibility to show them some measure of love and respect. Every person who is not a Christian in your life, that's the very person you ought to be gravitating towards so they know there is no distance between you and them because of how they believe by way of their religious or spiritual experience. I'm thinking back to the 1980s. Stephanie and I grew up in Canton, Ohio. And we, as some of you know, because I previously shared, we had a very difficult experience growing up. We grew up the first maybe 8 or 9 years of my life. I'm 2 years older than Stephanie. In a predominantly all-black housing project, then moved to a middle-class white neighborhood. The projects, drugs, crime, terrible things. In the middle-class white neighborhood, racism, another terrible thing. And that word was common. That summer of 90, it was a common word we heard whispered from our neighbors on the right and on the left. And we were not welcomed. I've told this story before. You know, we found that little cross burnt on our porch one morning, and it was a very difficult time. Very difficult time. The neighbor to our left, his name was Peter, and Peter gave us grief. He gave us considerable grief. And this was throughout the 1980s. We matured, and the siblings and I all went on to graduate high school and have professional careers. But my older sister Robin married in 1990. And as a point of fact, she married in 1992. And as a point of fact, Peter, the man who had uttered that N-word and treated us so foul for a decade, he was at my sister's wedding as a guest of honor. Why? Because that path I talked about called apology and then a hand extended that allows redemption to take place, that happened. And it's a modern day example of what we can be to one another, how we can get past the hurt and simply be right and good for each other. We all recognize, and surely as he did and I do now, our own limitations, our own ability to be foul and of ill repute where race relations are concerned, and we work hard to check our hearts and set circumstances to ensure that we are doing better. And then we work equally as hard to watch our words, to guard our hearts, and to say things that are uplifting, positive, and words that appreciate and applaud the human condition and the differences that exist between us. You want to know how we ought to live through Black History Month and onward for the good of America? Has to be that formula. Good to one another, upright in our words, extending the hand of redemption, embracing the art of the apology, and being what our forefathers knew we could be, and more importantly, what God expects. I'm Clarence Mingo, honored to be with you. Grace and peace to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clarence, Auditor Mingo. I appreciate it. Always a very inspirational speaker. I thought he'd be a good one for today, and I always leave a better man after I hear some of the things that he talks about. All right, thank you.